Hi, I'm Jim Phelps with psycheducation.org, and this is a talk about low doses of lithium to prevent dementia. So we're going to look at evidence that, sure enough, low doses of lithium can prevent dementia. What's the evidence for that? And then we'll look at what doses have been involved in the allegations that this might be so. And then finally, we'll look at the risks that are associated with using lithium in this way. Along the way, I hope we'll have some fun, including looking at things like lithiated lemon soda, the original 7-Up, looking at things like the suicide rates in Japan that go down or are lower in regions where there is a large amount of lithium in the municipal water supply. And I won't drag you through the remarkable detail with which it is now understood that lithium protects neurons. It's the whole idea behind this idea of using lithium to prevent dementia. And the molecular basis for the way in which lithium does this is remarkably well established through work in animals and some work in humans. So we know that lithium, sure enough, does protect neurons. And that's the reason why it's under consideration as something to protect neurons from developing dementia. Here's the bottom line in case you can't make it through the next 30 minutes. I think lithium might be worth considering for nearly everybody. The dose that you need may be related to your age, and there are risks, so you would want to do this in communication with your primary care provider. So let's start by looking at the evidence that low-dose lithium could prevent dementia. Well, there are two kinds of evidence we could turn to here. The indirect is when we compare people who are exposed to large amounts of lithium, say, in some fashion, and those who are exposed to less or none, and look at the rate at which they develop dementia. And remarkably, we can actually do that in the entire country of Denmark, courtesy of the researchers who have published this work, where they determined that these are the lithium levels in the water in Denmark, up to 30 micrograms per liter. And we'll come back to that unit and that quantity several times coming up here quickly. So you'll get used to those numbers. Now, the bottom line of this study was that in areas of great exposure, like those higher, darker green areas, the rate of developing dementia was slightly lower. Again, this is indirect data. It certainly doesn't clinch the idea, but it supports the idea. And this was published by a Denmark team led by Lars Kessing in 2017. Remember, 30 micrograms per liter, we'll compare that to where you live or other regions of the world anyway, including in the public drinking water in the United States, where those little red dots indicate regions where there is 60 micrograms, twice as much as in Denmark, or more. In fact, well more, as you'll see later. This was published in an article that just came out, so we wouldn't have been able to show you this up until very recently. And will allow us to examine the question of how much lithium is in your water, which you'll see I think is quite relevant. So the randomized trials then, now these are regarded by people in medicine as this is what's definitive, you need a randomized trial in order to really know something. So here's what we can see in randomized trials. Well, there were 4 or 5 of these up till 2014, conveniently collected in this table, which I won't go through, by Dr. Maurer and colleagues. Just wanted to show you that there have been randomized trials, small, short, low doses, before the big study that came out in 2019. So this paper, I think you need to know the details of it, and I'm going to show you how they did it and what they found. Starting with people who are 60 years of age or older, who had already some cognitive impairment. In the jargon term in our business is MCI, minimal cognitive impairment. They had MCI, which meant that they were at risk for developing dementia relatively soon. They were given a pill with 150 milligrams of lithium in it, or a placebo pill, and then the 150 milligram lithium group, the dose was increased until they had a blood level of 0.25 to 0.5. That's milliequivalents per liter. That's the standard way of us measuring lithium in your bloodstream when people are taking lithium. And that's kind of low dose lithium, because high dose lithium, full dose like we would use in bipolar 1, that's a blood level of 0.6 to 1.0 milliequivalents per liter. So you can think of that as full dose lithium. And what they did in the Forlenza study was low dose lithium. They then followed these people for 3 years, which is an achievement unto itself, because it's hard to keep people together for a randomized trial for that long, including people who are just taking a placebo. And here's how they measured outcomes. We're going to start with everybody not having Alzheimer's. So everybody starts out at the beginning well, at least in terms of not having Alzheimer's. And over time, people are going to develop Alzheimer's, and we'll come down that curve so that for a placebo group, for example, you see people are getting Alzheimer's, and they are, by 3 years out, 50%, only 50% of them don't have it anymore. This is kind of a funny graph called a survival analysis. But what we see is that everybody starts out without Alzheimer's, and then over time, a progressively smaller and smaller number still don't have Alzheimer's. More and more do. And at 3 years in the placebo group, it was about 50% have developed Alzheimer's, 50% haven't. So I hope you're looking now for the lithium result. What happened to the group that was taking lithium? How many of them still don't have Alzheimer's at 3 years? And the answer is here. A substantially lower percentage have developed Alzheimer's, and a much larger number of people still don't have it. In fact, at 3 years, 75% in that group versus 50% in the placebo group still don't have Alzheimer's. Now, that's the result. That was enough to convince me. I started taking lithium when this study came out, after I trotted off to my primary care provider with the article, as I'll explain to you how to do later. And I'm still in the vast majority because people don't know about this study still, which is why I'm doing this video actually. And yet this study has a couple problems. If you're a scientist, you use p-values. The p-value in this study is not quite statistically significant, and that's because the sample sizes were so small by the time they got to the end. Only 18 people in the lithium group, 16 people in the placebo group. In other branches of medicine, they laugh at these numbers, but that's because they have more research money than we do, and they think this is just totally inadequate. We need a bigger trial. Well, there is a bigger trial, and it is underway now. It's called LATTICE, an acronym for Lithium as a Treatment to Prevent Impairment of Cognitions in Elders. The lead investigator is Ariel Gildengers from the University of Pittsburgh. Their study is a little different than Forlenza. Same design, 60-year-olds, minimal and cognitive impairment, but their sample is much bigger. They're using much higher lithium levels, like full dose, 0.6 to 0.8 milliequivalents per liter, and they're using more outcome measures to be able to detect change short of developing an Alzheimer's diagnosis. So that's the evidence that we have, that one little study, but it was very suggestive. Some people think it ought to change dementia care even right now. But what doses to be used, as you'll see in a minute, depends, I think, on your age. So I'm going to take you through this table, which might seem like a long way to go, but I think it's fascinating, and I need to familiarize you with these numbers that are involved so you'll know what doses we're talking about here in terms of doses you might choose. And we'll start with Japan, and I'll show you the details and a reference for each of these studies. In Japan, you'll remember they were looking not at dementia, but suicide rates, and what they found, and you remember that graph, is the higher the lithium in the municipal water supply, the lower the suicide rate. This really started people thinking about microdoses of lithium as being psychoactive through that preservation of neurons mechanism, presumably, although we can't know that for sure at this stage. Now, in this study, you'll notice that this graph goes up to 60 micrograms, So that's double what was available in Denmark when you look at their water supplies. And that's why these results are a little stronger. And around the world, this has been replicated multiple times. The strongest results come from the places that have the largest lithium concentrations in some parts of the country, which makes sense. So the notion that suicide rate and municipal water supply lithium are related is now relatively well accepted in the field of psychiatry, and that lithium in general, like when we use it clinically, can lower suicide rates, very well accepted. And then we go to Texas, where in some parts of the country, the northwest corner, some parts of the state, 10 times as much, over 500 micrograms per liter, courtesy of the USGS well sampling. But that's not the highest in the world. In some of those villages that are the highest in the Andes in Argentina, there are concentrations as high as 1,000 micrograms per liter. And Dr. Broberg and colleagues went to Argentina to measure these concentrations, and I'm going to come back to that article at the very end when we're talking about risk, and you'll see why I think this article is important. Then there's Lithium spring water. You can buy this from the company. They'll ship it to you monthly. For about $50 a month, you can be drinking, it's 500 micrograms in every liter. So if you drank this all month and drank a liter a day, you'd be up in the neighborhood of Northwest Texas in terms of how much lithium you were getting drinking 1 liter of Lithium spring water. You know, ironically, in the old days, there was 7-Up, not this 7-Up, but this 7-Up, where there was lithium in the 7-Up, and the label is amazing. On the label, it says, neutralizes free acid, dispels hangovers, and at the bottom of the label, it says, takes the ouch out of grouch. Literally, on the label, they were saying this stuff is psychoactive, which we now know, indeed, well, they knew then too, I think, that's true. But since we don't have 7-Up like that anymore, you would be stuck with lithium spring water if you want to take that approach. Now this talk turns to lithium in pills. Lithium orotate, which is another formulation of lithium, is available in the grocery store without a prescription. A 5 milligram version of this, take 5 milligrams, that's 5,000 micrograms. So by comparison now, we're 10 times higher with 1 pill per day than you're getting from a liter of lithium spring water. And this costs about $5 a month to take that much per day. As you'll see at the end, I'm not advocating you do this. There's some risks. I think they go even with this, but it's certainly easier than shipping the water to you from Lithium Springs. Indeed, there is a 20 milligram pill. This is $15 a month on average when I just looked, and that would get you 20,000 micrograms per pill per day. And then there's prescription lithium carbonate. That's what they used in the Forlenza study, 150 milligram pill. This is what I prescribe. This is what I take because it's the lowest prescription lithium I can get. This is 150 milligrams. That's of elemental lithium. If we do the math using the table of elements, that's 28 milligrams of elemental lithium. So that comes to 28,000 micrograms per pill, per capsule of elemental lithium if you go this route. And in the Forlenza study, that's where they started, 150, but then they went up from there until they had blood levels of 0.25 to 0.5, and so they were using more than 28,000. And then finally, in the lattice study, they start with 150, and then they go up and they're targeting 0.6 to 0.8 blood levels, which means they're using doses that are going to be like 600 to 900 milligrams as opposed to 150. And so their doses per day is up in the over 100,000 micrograms per day compared to water supply. Most parts of the United States, it's somewhere between 2 and 50, with those exceptions like Northwest Texas. Now, to summarize then on doses, if you are supplementing whatever you might be getting from your water, which in most cases in the United States is very little, if you're supplementing, you're going to be doing it with something like this. So which dose, which one of these should you do this if you're going to do it? Well, again, before you get too excited, don't forget there's a risk to this. And so you shouldn't launch off and go buy one of these. You should learn more about risk, and we'll get there in just a second. But I want to finish up this section on dose by looking at its relationship with age. So we're connecting age of dementia and in a minute the dose that you might consider. Well, as you get older, your risk of dementia goes up. If you're unlucky, you are at high risk early. If you're luckier, your risk comes on later. But either way, this process can be getting underway, and you wouldn't even necessarily know it until you develop minimal cognitive impairment, MCI. And you wouldn't even know that that was developing when you were back here where you had no detectable cognitive problems, and yet the process was underway. So really what we want to be doing is intervening younger, much earlier in this process. Now, there are ways to detect the development of Alzheimer's earlier. In fact, there are all these different colored ways. And the idea is that the detection threshold is way back here when these things first begin to appear, that there is a problem. And if you detected it then, well, then you'd know where you were going, and maybe like then you should start taking lithium. The problem is these tests are not routinely available. These, I'll just give you an idea of what they are then. Cerebrospinal fluid A beta, this is the pleated sheet molecule that is part of the Alzheimer's pathology. And to get CSF, cerebrospinal fluid, you have to do a spinal tap, a lumbar puncture. And that's painful or somewhat and has risk, so we don't routinely do this. You could ask someone to do it if you needed a spinal tap for some other reason, but I hope that you don't. Amyloid is another protein that develops and is laid down in quantity in Alzheimer's brains, and it can be detected with positron emission tomography scanning, PET scanning. But PET scanning is expensive and not widely available, and so that's not routinely done either. And again, tau is a protein, and it turns up in the CSF, but we don't go do spinal taps to look for it. And then if you do an MRI and combine it with fluorodeoxyglucose PET, so you have a combined scan of what regions are developing the abnormal proteins like tau and A beta, and use an MRI to locate the particular places where this is happening. That combined scan is available now and is paid for, I believe, by Medicare, but you wouldn't get it until the risks are really high. You'd be up in the MCI range because it's just too much to be doing this for everybody when they're way down here in the lower age ranges. So basically, we don't know what your risk is, and yet we can conclude from looking at the countrywide data that nearly everyone is at risk of this, and most people are at significant risk of having dementia develop when they're in their 70s and certainly by their 80s. Not that you're going to get it, but the risk is high. So if we're going to do an intervention, and if we had one that was cheap and great, if it was harmless, we might consider doing that intervention long before in order to prevent this. That's the whole idea, right? Okay, so when, lithium, how much? Well, one way to think about this is don't wait for cognitive impairment, start earlier, and then start your lithium sooner. And then you could start with the lower doses if you're younger, because you'll have plenty of years to accumulate lithium exposure. And if you're older like me, then you better start your lithium at higher doses if you really want to have more assurance that this effect is going to work. And that's why they use the higher doses in the Lattice study. So full dose if you're up there. They used low doses, even though they started kind of over in the same place. In the Forlenza study, I think if you're farther back, you could use a low dose like me, no cognitive impairment, I don't think. And then even earlier, If you're starting this when you're younger, you could use this microdose approach using lithium orotate, or maybe even getting it out of your water, which brings us back to how much is in your water. So we should go ask. Well, here's how much is in your water in the United States. And we have a table from the USGS that I got from the investigators. Thank you. So I'm going to invite you to write me, jimp@psycheducation.org, if you want to know how much lithium is in your water. Which brings us then lastly to risk. Almost done here because the risks aren't many, but they're significant enough that we have to pay attention. And the first is the kidney. Well, if you bring this to your primary care provider, I can just about guarantee you that you're going to get some hesitation, probably some pushback, and most of it will revolve around the risk to your kidney, which is ironic because even in full dose lithium, that's a relatively rare problem, I should say uncommon, relatively uncommon, and it's associated with really big doses. So the doses we're looking at for prevention of Alzheimer's are tiny by comparison, or especially down in the orotate range. And so whether there's any risk to your kidney at all is pretty unlikely, actually. Nevertheless, we need to know that your kidney function is normal before you start and stays normal. So you need a blood test for that. And your doctor, primary care provider, can help you look at any other drugs you might be taking that are affected by lithium, and there are a couple of them, and any other conditions that might be affected. Your PCP, your primary care provider, just deserves to be on board. And when you do that, you're going to get such resistance, I fear, that I think you need to be prepared. When you go in to see your doc, I think you need to carry the Forlenza paper with you, printed out and ready to give it to them. I'll show you in a minute how to get it, because that's the key paper, the one that was the unrecognized but really important paper that I was making such a big deal out of. So you carry that paper in with you, and then you very respectfully and politely say, gosh, I have heard about this study and I just wanted to share this idea with you that I wonder if this might actually be something that I should consider. And I really appreciate everything you've done for me so far, and I hope will continue to do. So I don't mean to tell you what to do, but I just did want to wonder about this approach. You get the idea. So with that gentle, soft pedal approach, you carry in this paper, the Forlenza paper, and here's how to get it off the internet. Go to Google Scholar, enter Forlenza 2019 Lithium Dementia, and that'll take you straight to that paper. And at the top of the right-hand column, you'll see a PDF from cambridge.org. Download that, print it, take it with you. All right, I'm sorry to tell you how to talk with your doc, but it's just so likely that you're going to get hesitation because this is so little understood that there's any rationale to doing this now. When the latest study comes out, that ought to help if the results are the same. And then there's thyroid. You need a thyroid test before you start doing this because full dose lithium is associated with 10% of the people who take that develop hypothyroidism, too little thyroid hormone. We don't know what low-dose lithium or microdose lithium does in terms of this kind of impact on your thyroid. Can it cause hypothyroidism? There are some hints, though, that that's true. Even microdose, like in the water, well, the reason I mentioned that study in the high Andes, remember this one, Broberg and colleagues? The reason they did that study is because they wanted to look at thyroid function in women, because women are more susceptible to this, women in these Andean villages. And sure enough, they found lower thyroid levels, technically that's higher TSH levels, in the women living in these high villages compared to those who didn't have this kind of lithium exposure. So I think there are suggestive data that even what you get out of lithium orotate could affect your thyroid, and that's why you need a thyroid test before you start, and then you need another thyroid test to make sure that even minimal effects on your thyroid are detected, and considered in terms of what you're doing. So, in summary, go to your primary care provider, take the Forlenza article, get a thyroid test, and then you can decide about the dose you should take based on your age. And thank you for listening.